Pleasant day to all of you, Yums 12. We are in our second week of creative writing. We are still discussing imaginative writing, specifically the ingredients of it, which includes imagery, figure of speech, and here in my presentation, I will be talking about diction. This is what we call diction. When we say diction, it is the careful selection of words to communicate a message or establish a particular voice or writing style. For example, if you're writing poetry, most probably you will be using figures of speech, imagery, or sound devices to make your poems a little more meaningful and colorful. Unlike if you write a research paper or a technical paper, most probably you will be using a direct language formal vocabulary. And so that is what we call diction. Our choice of words will depend on what are we writing. Let me start with the purposes of diction in writing. Number one is to create a certain tone that supports the purpose. For example, if I am writing poetry and my purpose in writing poetry is to entertain, to express my feelings and thoughts, now by the use of diction, I will be supporting that purpose by, number one, using figures of speech. If I use figures of speech in poetry, therefore, I am supporting my purpose of writing poetry, and that is to express my feelings and thoughts. I will also use similes, metaphors, or imagery to support my purpose of expressing my feelings and thoughts in my poems. Now, if, for example, a researcher is conducting a research, and his purpose of writing a research is to inform, to educate. Therefore, the choice of words that that person will use should be technical, should be specific, and a little formal, because what you are writing is research paper, not poetry. So that is the first purpose of diction. We use diction so that we can support the purpose for our writing. Second purpose of diction is to support the setting, especially if we are writing fiction or short stories, novels. We use choice of words. Our choice of words would also impact the setting of our story. For example, if my setting of the story is in an old England setting, therefore I should be knowledgeable of the words used during that period of old England, because our choice of words should reinforce the kind of setting that we are trying to establish in that short story. Okay? A story that is set in New York City will have a different style of diction compared to a story that takes place in Tondo, Manila. So that is the second purpose of diction, to support the setting, the place, the time of our fiction. The third purpose is to establish a narrative voice and tone. Now, when we say tone, it is the attitude of the writer towards what he or she is writing. Now, how do we identify the tone? It is also through diction, the choice of words of the author. For example, if an author is an author of a horror novel, he or she must have words that are kind of used for scaring people or for making us chill or making us feel goosebumps. Unlike if I am a romance novel, most probably my choice of words would be sweet and romantic, light-hearted. So when we use our diction, it is also helpful in creating or establishing the voice and the tone of our story. Another purpose of diction is to bring characters to life. We get to know more the characters in the story by their choice of words. We get to know their background, we get to know their profession, we get to know their social status when we analyze the choice of words that they use. So that's another purpose of diction. Now let me proceed with the types of diction that we can use in writing. Let's start with the formal diction. When we say formal diction, it is the use of grammatical rules. So we strictly follow the rules of grammar when we structure the sentences in our paper. So that is formal diction. Usually we use formal diction in professional articles, business documents, legal papers. That is where we can apply formal diction. Informal diction, on the other hand, is quite conversational and it is more applicable in narrative literature. Informal diction also shows how people communicate in real life. So if we want to achieve a more realistic effect of our short story, we can use informal diction, especially with our characters, to make our characters more relatable, more realistic, and more entertaining, because informal diction is the one that we use for conversation. So the more we use informal diction in our short stories, the more we make it more personal, more conversational, more relatable. So that is what we call informal diction. Colloquial diction is also informal in a way, but when we say colloquial diction, it is generally specific to a certain region or time. Take for example the words "aid" and "y'all." These are examples of colloquial expressions born in rural areas of the United States. So when we say colloquial diction, these are set of words that are specific to a certain region or to a certain time. Just like my example before, if my setting of my story will be old London or old England, therefore I should be knowledgeable of the colloquial language during that period or during that time. Now why should we use colloquial? Colloquial diction can add color and make our story more realistic also. Slang diction. Slang diction can be a new word or a shortened or a modified word. And sometimes we use slang diction in social media nowadays, right? The phrase "to throw a shade on someone" is slang diction, because when you say "throw shade," that means you're trying to express an insult at someone else. So it's part of slang diction. Poetic diction is, of course, most of the time applicable to poetry. especially when using descriptive language. We also use rhyme scheme, rhyme, to make sounds in poetry. So that is what we call poetic diction. We try to make the words lyrical.
Let's have an example from To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper. This is a quotation, or this is a line or a dialogue from Atticus Finch, who is the founder of Scout in the novel. Now, if you look at the first line, you just hold your head high and keep those fists down. Atticus uses a very formal language in his profession. Since in the novel he is a celebrated lawyer. Now, when talking to his daughter, he is changing his diction. Look at the sentences in this dialogue. It's short, it's simple, and understandable. He also uses cliches like hold your head high and don't you let them get your goat. This informal diction shows the degree of relationship of Atticus to his daughter. Using this kind of diction reveals his close relationship with his daughter, and also the impact of this informal diction to us readers is that we see Atticus as more approachable this time than seeing him in a lawyerly role in the novel.
Another example by Mark Twain, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Mark Twain's book of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is so full of colloquialism or colloquial diction. He uses plenty of accent, slang, vernacular, so that we would believe that the characters are real Americans of that time. Okay, for example, the words or the phrases "ain't no trouble" is also a colloquial term that may mean just the same, or no problem at all. Now let's move on to the next example by Henry IV, Part 1 by William Shakespeare. Now, if you look at it, the example, it's kind of hard to read, right? Because William Shakespeare was able to use slang diction. Actually, he was able to create new slang terms. Okay? Basically, the example was just about Falstaff. He's a character. Falstaff was insulting the person he's talking to with a lot of slang terms. So that is what we call slang diction. Now, let's move on to denotation versus connotation, because these two are also part of what we call diction. The choice of words that we use can also be denotative or connotative. Now, when we say denotation, it is just the literal dictionary definition of a word. Okay? For example, I'll be using the words plump and obese. So both words would mean an overweight person. But if you use connotation, the meaning will change, because connotation refers to the implied or suggested meaning. Sometimes there is an emotional attachment, there is an emotional tag that goes along with the word, and that is what we call connotation. Now, looking at the same example, Plump and obese, if we use connotation, will have different meaning. In denotation, they have the same meanings. They are synonyms. But in connotation, no. Plump would be more pleasant to use to describe women. But if we use obese in connotation, it has a more technical connotation. It's more medical in turn, right? Although they may have similar literal definition, when we use connotation, they will become different. Okay? Plump would have a more emotional tag, but the word obese would have a more scientific, medical tag. That is what we call connotation.